Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon, Professor Spoder.
A lot has happened since we talked last.
I should say.
I think what is happening is something that we've talked about before, but it keeps developing and getting more interesting. And people have already been writing in the media that it may be the end of the nation state as we know it. But certainly the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1921 seems to not have much of a future. And everything that's going on in the world today seems to have something to do with the non-functioning of national boundaries that were imposed at the end of the Age of Empires.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the way that's working is different in different parts of the world. So the Chinese are having a problem with the Uyghurs because they're trying to preserve their empire. The Russians are having trouble with the Ukrainians because they don't want to lose part of their empire to Europe. And then, of course, the Ottoman Empire, which was broken up into European-sized entities in 1921, is beginning to reorganize itself. And Erdogan, the Prime Minister of Turkey, seems to have an amazingly intelligent attitude towards this. He's negotiating directly with the Kurds, I think, and being much more pragmatic about the relationship between Turkey and the Kurds than any of his predecessors have been.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Partly because he doesn't like the Sunni Arabs, even though they're Sunni Muslims like himself.
Yeah.
And then, of course, Saudi Arabia is having difficulties, and it's not clear how that's going to sort itself out. Saudi Arabia, essentially, of course, is a state that that formed itself in the first half of the 20th century, but its boundaries were the extent to which it was allowed to go, rather than what it decided for itself.
Right.
So it's a really interesting situation if we can be patient and wait and see what's going to happen, rather than getting too involved emotionally in particular parts of it at the moment. Because obviously a lot of people are suffering terribly.
I've been reminded over the past few days about the international conferences that occurred, I believe, in Paris in the latter part of the 19th century, when the Western world had begun to reach a point of industrialization with telegraph and railways and universal time requirements, where they sat down and from a technocrat kind of perspective agreed on standardization for international telling of time, for example, for international megahertz bands that would be promulgated, for international standards of railway gauges, although the Russians didn't follow that, et cetera, et cetera. And all of that legacy is largely still with us, and I've begun to think as to, for example, with the Malaysian plane that was shot down in Ukraine, it's like, well, okay, I mean, would we be able to replicate that sort of a meeting today? Would we be able to convene everybody together and agree, for example, on internet protocols, which I'm quite sure governments, possibly with the exception of the United States, don't have any say in promulgating or agreeing to?
Well, sorry, don't let me interrupt you, but it worked in the first half of the century because it was under British leadership, worked in the second half of the 20th century under American leadership, and the Americans are being forced gradually to give up leadership of things like ICANN, the Internet Addressing System, now. And we're beginning to see that we've got to get used to a new system in which nobody is going to be able to organize it for everybody else.
No, I agree with that. There's been a real erosion now, and perhaps it took me a long time to get it, so to speak, but when an international civilian airliner can be shot down over a country in an air corridor that no fewer than 400 passenger planes passed that day, all right, that this one was shot down by accident, presumably. But it's like, well, wait a minute. I mean, didn't the people who have the missile take any special precautions because they were aware that this was an air corridor? And then now with the inability to affix any responsibility or anyone admitting responsibility, it just puts everything in danger. And I mean, I can understand the benefits of globalization, but this is one example of one of the negatives of it, in that the I don't know the not the sovereign states, because we have agreed that they're probably going to fade away, but that the control and responsibility mechanisms haven't caught up yet. And I don't know. I mean, they have to come, or there's going to be utter chaos in the future, like 200 years from now. There have to be governmental slash control slash responsibility mechanisms in place at the end of all this.
Well, let me try to explain how I see this.
All right.
I think that everything you've just said is exactly the way most people see it now, but actually that it's a way of seeing things which has developed out of the way things have been and the way that the current situation has come to be. And I think we're now in this period of transition between the age in which there were strong states and weak states, and the strong states were essentially empires and the weak states were called nation states, even though they mostly weren't nations to begin with. And the empires have disintegrated for the most part, and I think those that haven't yet disintegrated are on the way. And the other political entities that were told they were nation states aren't able to work as nation states anymore. And you can see this going on in so many different parts of the world now, throughout Africa as well as Asia and even parts of Europe. But what is happening is, if you see this in a much longer term perspective, the whole nation state idea was a particular stage in the growth of the size of arenas of social interaction.
Okay.
That you could, if you want to use anthropological terminology, you can say started off with the tribe. That it started off with bands of hunters and gatherers, and then with coalitions of those bands, which we call, looking back on them, tribes. And then we had settlements and agricultural societies that gradually became civilizations. And then empires, of course, started in the ancient world and got bigger and bigger and bigger. And then at the end of the age of empires, we got the nation state. And what's happening now with globalization is we're gradually working towards a situation where there would be none of these divisions within the species, but the whole species would be one arena of interaction. And that's going to be completely different from anything we've seen before, because it means that everything will be organized, what shall I say, not according to a constitution, which of course is going to be very difficult for Americans to get used to, but according to continuous processes of negotiation. And the big problem is going to be between people who cooperate with each other and people who think of themselves in terms of boundaries between them and others. And that's what's happening in the world at the moment, that larger and larger proportion of the world's population is working together, interacting together without fighting. But everywhere in the world, there are significant places where social boundaries have developed, and often they're boundaries that have been there for a long time, but have only just become the most important political factor in the region. And there's fighting, and it's very difficult to resolve those boundaries.
Well,
so,
if humanity's fate is to spend increasingly larger amounts of time negotiating with each other so we can simply live on the same planet together, I view that as an incredible impediment to further development.
Isn't that what we do all the time anyway?
Well, I'd like to think we don't. Now we're actually finally striking at the deeper issues. For
It's
example,
just a question of whether it will be done through lawyers or not. But I mean, we're desperately now trying to develop a system of international law.
hmm
So that's not one of my specialties, but my impression is that it's not moving terribly fast
hmm
as an efficient system, even though more and more effort is being put into it every year. Um, it's very difficult to create a system that everybody will see as even for everybody.
I think it's impossible.
It wasn't important in the past,
Yeah.
but now it is because we've got an evening out of the socio-political awareness
hmm
in all parts of the world's population.
hmm Well, I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more about, and you followed the theme that I mentioned actually, and but I don't quite see it yet. When you talk about, I understand that there will possibly eventually be one horizontal evening out, one process of one unified mass of people. But how are they going to be regulated or governed? I mean, within themselves? I mean, I don't, that's the part I've never understood in all of our discussions as we
The
move toward this and talk about the erosion of boundaries, the erosion of governments, the erosion of states. I mean, is it going to be like a North American bloc, an African bloc, or I mean,
the process of regulation that we've had faith in for um, several centuries, which has emerged out of the medieval period and gradually been rationalized mainly in the 19th century and then more and more detail added in the 20th century, is working less and less efficiently.
I agree.
So that even though actually, of course, we're being told that crime rates have dropped in New York and Philadelphia over the last 10 years, in general, that's not really I don't think it's really a reduction in crime rates. It's a change in the way we think about crime,
hmm
because there there is a continuing effort to um, run a justice system that is based on the idea of vengeance, that picks people up and puts them in jail, and we've got more people in jail than we can afford to keep in jail. And the punishment system isn't working, and of course the problems with um, uh, execution.
Yes, I was going to say we do administer 2-hour executions though.
It obviously isn't working anymore. We
Yeah,
can't work out. It's amazing that we're so bad at killing people
yeah,
when it comes to doing it in the justice system,
yeah,
when we're so efficient at doing it in other systems.
yes.
But I think this is all part of this transition. And we've got to get used to the idea that deviance is not something that could be. I mean, currently deviance is punished because it deviates from an established system, but the established system is out of date,
hmm Yes,
and it's got to be reworked in such a way that it is flexible and can be continually reworked in order to get rid of all the unevennesses in it.
the established system is itself becoming the deviant.
Hmm. So I see all this as part of the difficulties of this crucial phase that we're
hmm
working through. And of course, the problem is we don't know how long this is going to last, and it could last the whole of the current century. But since everything is moving faster and faster all the time, it's possible that it won't take that long.
Yeah.
But as we've said before in these sessions, no nation-state government at the moment is really working efficiently, and no justice system is working efficiently.
hmm
And it's just that we have nothing to put in place of them, and we have so much faith in them, and we can't see any other options. But gradually, what is happening all the time is that the social momentum is taking over from the previous system without us realizing what's happening,
Well,
without things being actually designed.
well, I think one possible way to struggle for an answer as to what will come next is to look at what's motivating the social momentum. I mean, what are the movements of the currents of social momentum being caused by? I mean, because plainly what's going to come is not going to be of a color or a shape that we recognize. It's going to be very different. I
Well,
mean,
I
it's
think I think what's the engine behind the social momentum is the well, still to some extent increasing numbers of people, but more important than that now is the continuing acceleration in the increase of numbers of people interacting with each other in different parts of the world.
mhm.
So, I mean, I went to New York on Thursday to see a performance of the Bolshoi Ballet at the Lincoln Center, and in traveling, I was watching the people that were traveling with me, and they were all on their smartphones all the time.
Yes,
And it's absolutely amazing the degree of connectedness
yes.
among all sorts of people. And some of these were obviously wealthy people, some of them were middle class people, and some of them were very poor people. But
Hmm.
it was difficult to find anybody without a smartphone.
That's an interesting observation. You're exactly correct. Yeah.
And I think that's what's driving the change. And we're told by the people who make demographic predictions that the rate of population growth is declining, and population will reach a new plateau within the next half century or so, and will stop increasing. And so then we'll get changes in the age-sex pyramid throughout the world gradually. But nevertheless, because of the increase in the rates, in the proportion of the total that is in interaction with each other all the time, the rate of change will continue because more and more people all the time will be hearing things that they're not used to,
Right, right.
and
Yeah.
get used to the idea of hearing things that they're not used to. And they'll be experimenting, they'll be innovating in ways that never used to be the case.
So it will lead to something that we've not seen before.
I think that the amount of novelty that we're going to see, even within what's left of my lifetime, is something that's difficult for us to foresee.
Well, I guess on that note, we'll leave it. That's actually very optimistic. I'm looking forward to it. All right.
Okay, we'll see
Thank,
how much of it's happened by next week.
thank you, Professor. All right.